If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Michael Callahan, and I've been a park ranger for over 20 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here in the boundary waters of Minnesota, wild animals behaving oddly, hikers claiming they saw ghosts, and even the occasional UFO sighting. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that winter. It was the coldest winter I'd ever experienced. The kind that bites through your skin no matter how many layers you wear. The kind where even your breath freezes mid-air. The snowstorms had been relentless, piling up so high that some cabins were completely buried. People were scared to go outside, and honestly, I didn't blame them. I was stationed at a remote ranger outpost near the edge of the forest. My job was simple: monitor the weather, keep an eye on wildlife, and make sure campers didn't wander too far off the trails. But this winter was different. There weren't any campers. No one dared to venture into the wilderness, with temperatures dropping below -40 degrees Fahrenheit at night. I wasn't alone at the outpost. There were 3 other rangers with me: Peterson, a tough-as-nails woman who'd been working here almost as long as I had, Wright, a younger guy fresh out of training who still had that spark of excitement in his eyes, and Redfeather, a quiet man from the Ojibwe tribe who knew these woods better than anyone else. We all got along pretty well, but the isolation was starting to get to us. Days felt like weeks, and nights, well, nights were a whole different story. The wind howled like a living thing outside our cabin, rattling the windows and making it impossible to sleep. One night, as I sat by the fire trying to warm my hands, Redfeather spoke up. He rarely said much unless he had something important to share. "Have you noticed anything strange?" he asked, his voice low. Peterson raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" Redfeather hesitated before answering. "The animals, they spur gone." I frowned. He was right. Usually, even in winter, we'd see tracks in the snow: deer, foxes, maybe even wolves if we were lucky. But for weeks now, there hadn't been a single sign of life. "Maybe they've moved deeper into the forest," Wright suggested. "Maybe," Redfeather said quietly. But there was something in his tone that made me uneasy. The next morning, Peterson and I decided to take a snowmobile out to check on one of the nearby cabins. It belonged to a couple who'd come up here every winter for as long as I could remember. They hadn't checked in for weeks, and we were starting to worry. When we arrived at their cabin, it was eerily silent. The front door was wide open, snow piled up on the threshold like no one had been there for days. Inside, it was worse. The place looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Chairs knocked over, food left half-eaten on the table. But what really sent chills down my spine was what we found in the bedroom. The windows were completely frosted over from the inside, and there were strange patterns etched into the ice, spirals, and symbols I didn't recognize. On the bed lay 2 sleeping bags zipped up tight, but when we unzipped them, they were empty. No bodies, no blood, just gone. Peterson cursed under her breath and took a step back. "What the hell is this?" I didn't have an answer. We searched the area around the cabin but found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no signs of struggle. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. When we got back to the outpost and told Redfeather what we'd seen, his face went pale. "It's not safe here," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Wright asked nervously. Redfeather didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to his bunk and pulled out an old leather-bound book. He flipped through its yellowed pages before stopping at a drawing. A creature with long limbs, sharp teeth, and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through you. "The Wendigo?" he said softly. I laughed nervously. "Come on, Redfeather. That SIP's just an old legend." He looked up at me with eyes full of fear. Legends come from somewhere. The days after Redfeather showed us that drawing felt heavier somehow. The air seemed colder, the nights darker. None of us said it out loud, but we were all on edge. Even Wright, who usually cracked jokes to lighten the mood, had gone quiet. I tried to convince myself that Redfeather's warning was just superstition. I mean, a Wendigo. a flesh-eating monster that stalks people in the woods. It sounded like something out of a campfire story, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few days later, Peterson and I went out again, this time to check on a wildlife monitoring station about 10 miles from our outpost. It was a small shed equipped with cameras and sensors to track animal movements. We hadn't gotten any data from it in weeks, and we figured the equipment might have frozen over. The ride there was uneventful, but as we approached the station, I noticed something strange. The snow around the shed was disturbed, like something had been pacing back and forth in front of it, but there were no footprints. Just long, smooth trails in the snow, almost like something had been dragged. Peterson saw it too. "What do you think made those?" she asked. I shook my head. Could be wind. She didn't look convinced. Inside the shed, things were worse. The cameras had been smashed to pieces, and the sensors were ripped out of their mounts. It looked like someone or something had torn through the place in a frenzy. "Animals don't do this," Peterson muttered. I bent down to pick up one of the broken cameras and noticed something strange on the lens. It looked like frost, but when I touched it, it felt sticky, almost like sap. "We should head back," I said quickly. "This isn't set normal." Peterson nodded, her face pale. As we stepped outside, I swear I heard something, a faint whisper carried by the wind. It sounded like my name. "Michael." I froze in place and turned to Peterson. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. I didn't answer. Instead, I scanned the tree line around us. The forest was still too still, not even the sound of branches creaking in the wind or birds chirping. "Let's go," I said firmly. The ride back to the outpost felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed darker, every gust of wind louder. By the time we got back, I was practically shaking. Red Feather was waiting for us by the fire when we walked in. He took one look at our faces and knew something had happened. "What did you see?" he asked. I hesitated before answering. The station was destroyed, and I heard something. Red Feather Sep's expression hardened. "It steps here." "What steps here?" Wright asked nervously. "The Wendigo," Red Feather said simply. Peterson scoffed. "You can seriously believe that?" Red Feather didn't argue with her. Instead, he pulled out his book again and flipped to another page, a map of the boundary waters marked with red dots. "These are places where people have disappeared over the years," he explained. "Always during winters like this." I leaned closer to look at the map and felt my stomach drop. One of those red dots was right where we were now, the ranger outpost. "That doesn't prove anything," Peterson said stubbornly. Red Feather sighed and closed the book. "You don't have to believe me," he said quietly, "but you should be careful." That night, as we sat around the fire trying to keep warm, Wright suddenly spoke up. "Do you guys ever feel like we stir being watched?" We all turned to look at him. "I mean it," he continued nervously. "Sometimes when I step him outside, it feels like there's someone just behind me." No one answered him right away, but I knew exactly what he meant because I'd felt it too. The prickling sensation on the back of my neck whenever I stepped outside into the snow. Red Feather finally broke the silence. "It Sep's hungry." "What do you mean?" Wright asked shakily. "The Wendigo is a spirit of hunger," Red Feather explained calmly. "It feeds on fear and flesh." Peterson rolled her eyes but didn't say anything this time. As I lay in my bunk that night, staring at the frost-covered window above me, I couldn't stop thinking about what Red Feather had said. Was it possible? Could there really be something out there? Just as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard it again, the whispering voice from earlier. "Michael." The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been restless, filled with shadows moving through the snow and whispers calling my name. When I got up and looked around the cabin, I could tell I wasn't the only one feeling it. Wright was sitting by the window, staring out into the forest with a blank expression. Peterson was pacing back and forth, muttering to herself. Even Red Feather looked uneasy. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on my work. There was always something to do, checking supplies, monitoring the radio for weather updates, keeping the fire going. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. Around noon, Wright volunteered to go outside and gather more firewood. He was trying to act normal, but I could tell he was nervous. "I'll be back in a few minutes," he said, as he pulled on his coat and stepped out into the snow. We all stayed quiet as he left. The sound of the door closing echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 15. "He should be back by now," Peterson said, breaking the silence. "I'll check on him," I offered. Red Feather stood up. I said, "I'll come with you." We grabbed our coats and stepped outside into the freezing cold. The snow crunched under our boots as we walked toward the woodpile behind the cabin. But when we got there, Wright was nowhere to be seen. "Wright?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Red Feather knelt down and pointed at something in the snow, footprints leading away from the cabin and into the forest. They were deep and uneven, like Wright had been running. "Why would he go into the woods?" I asked aloud. Red Feather didn't answer. He just started following the tracks, motioning for me to come with him. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The trees around us grew thicker, their bare branches reaching out like claws in the dim light. The footprints led us deeper and deeper until we reached a clearing, and that's when we saw it. The snow in front of us was stained red. At first I thought it was blood, but as we got closer I realized it wasn't. It was frost-tinted with a strange reddish hue that shimmered in the light. In the center of the clearing stood Wright's axe, buried deep in the ground as if someone had slammed it there with all their strength. But there was no sign of Wright. "What is this?" I whispered. Red Feather knelt down again and touched the red frost with his gloved hand. He closed his eyes for a moment before standing up and turning to me. "It's a warning," he said simply. "A warning from what?" I asked desperately. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed toward the edge of the clearing where something caught my eye, a single set of footprints leading away from us. They weren't human footprints, though. They were long and narrow with claw-like impressions at each step. "We need to go back," Red Feather said firmly. I didn't argue. When we returned to the cabin, Peterson was waiting for us by the fire. Her face lit up when she saw us walk through the door, but when she realized Wright wasn't with us, her expression darkened. "What happened?" she demanded. "We found his axe," I said quietly, "but no sign of him." Peterson cursed under her breath and slammed her fist against the table. "This is insane. We need to call for help." "The radio's dead," Red Feather reminded her calmly. Peterson paced back and forth again before stopping suddenly and looking at me. "You heard something last night? Didn't set you?" "What did it say?" I hesitated before answering. "It called my name." She stared at me for a moment before shaking her head angrily. "This isn't set real," she muttered to herself. "It can set be real." Red Feather sat down by the fire and opened his book again. "The Wendigo doesn't set just hunt its prey," he said softly. "It makes them lose their minds first." "Great," Peterson snapped sarcastically. "So now we're all going crazy. It feeds on fear." Red Feather continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets." I sat down beside him and stared into the flames of the fire, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. Wright was gone. Something unnatural had left those clawed footprints in the snow, and now Red Feather was telling us that fear itself was making things worse. I didn't know what to believe anymore. That night, none of us slept well. Not even Peterson, who usually prided herself on being tough as nails. Every creak of wood or gust of wind outside made us jump like frightened rabbits. And then, just before dawn, we heard it. A scream long and piercing that echoed through the forest like a dying animal calling out for help. It sounded like Wright Sepp's voice. The scream froze all of us in place. It was unmistakable, Wright's voice, sharp and desperate, cutting through the silence of the early morning. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stared at each other, wide-eyed, as the sound faded into the cold air outside. "We have to go find him," Peterson said, grabbing her coat. "Wait," Red Feather said firmly. "It's Sepp's, not him." What are you talking about? Peterson snapped. You heard him. He steps out there. Red Feather shook his head slowly. It sits not right. It sits the Wendigo. I felt my stomach twist at his words. How do you know? The Wendigo mimics voices. Red Feather explained calmly. It uses them to lure people out into the woods. Peterson looked at him like he was crazy. You expect me to believe that Wright is out there, and he needs our help? Peterson, I said gently, trying to keep my voice steady. What if he sets right? What if he sets a trap? She glared at me but didn't argue. Instead, she sat down by the fire and buried her face in her hands. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. None of us wanted to go outside, not after hearing that scream, but staying inside wasn't much better. The cabin felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in on us. Every sound outside, the wind, the creaking trees made my skin crawl. By nightfall, the blizzard had picked up again and the radio was still dead. We were completely cut off from the outside world. As we sat around the fire trying to keep warm, Peterson suddenly spoke up. What happens if we don't stop it? Red Feather looked up from his book. It once said stop. What do you mean? I asked nervously. The Wendigo is ancient, he explained. It doesn't start to kill people, it spreads its hunger. If it gets strong enough, it can turn others into Wendigos too. I felt a chill run down my spine. How does it do that? Red Feather hesitated before answering. Through hunger, Peterson scoffed. Well, that sip's comforting. Red Feather ignored her sarcasm and turned to me instead. Michael, you heard it calling your name. I nodded slowly. It's trying to get into your mind, he said quietly. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just stared into the fire and tried not to think about it. Later that night, as we all tried to sleep, I heard something again, this time louder than before. Michael. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a voice clear as day coming from just outside the cabin door. I sat up in my bunk and looked around. Peterson was still asleep, but Red Feather was awake, sitting by the window with his book in his lap. You hear it too? I asked softly. He nodded without looking at me. What do we do? I whispered. Red Feather turned to me with a serious expression. We wait. For what? For it to make its move. The next morning, we woke up to find that something had happened during the night. The snow outside was covered in strange patterns, spirals and symbols etched into the frost, like someone had carved them with a knife. They surrounded the cabin in a perfect circle, almost like a barrier. What is this? Peterson asked as we stood outside staring at the markings. It's a warning, Red Feather said simply. A warning from what? She demanded. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed toward the tree line where something caught my eye, a single figure standing in the distance. At first I thought it was Wright, but as I squinted through the snowstorm, I realized it wasn't him at all. The figure was tall and thin with long limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It's here, Red Feather said calmly. What do we do? Peterson asked nervously. Red Feather didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a small pouch from his coat and began sprinkling its contents around the cabin, a mixture of herbs and ashes that smelled faintly of smoke and earth. This will protect us for now, he said quietly. For now? I repeated nervously. Red Feather nodded. The Wendigo is patient. It will wait until we stir weak. I didn't know what else to say, so I just followed him back inside and locked the door behind us. That night was worse than any before it. The wind howled louder than ever, shaking the windows and rattling the walls of the cabin like it was trying to break inside. And then, we heard it again. The voice calling out from somewhere in the storm. Michael? Peterson. Red Feather. It knew our names now. The voices didn't stop. They called out to us all night, growing louder and more desperate with every passing hour. Sometimes it sounded like Wright. Other times it was a voice I didn't recognize. But the worst part was when it started sounding like my wife. Michael. Her voice whispered through the storm. Michael. It sets me, please. I sat frozen in my bunk, staring at the door as the sound echoed through the cabin. My wife had passed away years ago, But hearing her voice now soft and pleading made my chest tighten. It felt so real. "Don't listen to it," Redfeather said from across the room. His voice was calm but firm, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. I nodded slowly and forced myself to look away from the door. By morning, the storm had calmed down a little, but the tension inside the cabin was worse than ever. None of us spoke much as we ate breakfast. If you could call it that, we were running low on supplies, and all we had left were a few cans of beans and some stale crackers. "We need to do something," Peterson said suddenly. Breaking the silence, "What do you suggest?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "We go after it." Redfeather shook his head immediately. "That SEP's exactly what it wants." "So what? We just sit here and wait for it to kill us?" Peterson snapped. Redfeather didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out his book again and flipped to a page filled with drawings of symbols, similar to the ones we'd seen etched into the frost outside. "There's steps a way to stop it," he said quietly. "How?" I asked. Redfeather pointed to one of the symbols, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. "This is a purification ritual," he explained. "It can weaken the Wendigo enough for us to destroy it." "What do we need for it?" Peterson asked eagerly. "Fire," Redfeather said simply, "and courage." Later that day, as we prepared for the ritual, something happened that shook us all to our core. Wright came back. It was just before sunset when we heard footsteps outside, slow and heavy, crunching through the snow toward the cabin. At first we thought it was another trick, the Wendigo mimicking his movements to lure us out, but when we opened the door, there he was, standing in front of us with a blank expression on his face. "Right," Peterson exclaimed, rushing toward him. But Redfeather grabbed her arm and stopped her before she could get too close. "Wait," he said firmly. "What are you talking about?" "It's him," she argued. Redfeather didn't let go of her arm. Instead, he stepped forward cautiously and looked Wright in the eyes. "Where have you been?" he asked calmly. Wright didn't answer right away. He just stood there staring at us like he didn't recognize us. "Wright?" I said softly, stepping forward alongside Redfeather. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was strange, hollow and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I got lost," he said simply. Redfeather narrowed his eyes at him. "What happened in the woods?" Wright hesitated before answering. "I don't remember." Peterson tried to move closer again, but Redfeather stopped her once more. "Look at his hands," he whispered to me. I glanced down at Wright's hands and felt my stomach drop. His fingers were pale, almost white, and covered in frostbite so severe that parts of his skin looked blackened. But what really scared me were his nails. They were longer than they should have been, almost claw-like. "He's not right anymore," Redfeather said quietly. Peterson stared at him in disbelief. "What are you saying?" "SEP's been touched by the Wendigo," Redfeather explained calmly. "It's SEP's inside him now." "No," Peterson said firmly. "That SEP's ridiculous. He needs help." But before any of us could say or do anything else, Wright suddenly lunged forward, his movements quick and unnatural, and grabbed Peterson by the shoulders. She screamed as he pushed her against the wall with strength that didn't seem human. "Get off her," I shouted, rushing toward them. Redfeather grabbed Wright by the arm and pulled him back with surprising force, but not before Wright let out a guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. "Get him outside," Redfeather ordered. Together, we managed to shove Wright out of the cabin and lock the door behind him. He pounded on it for a few seconds before going silent again. But none of us dared look outside to see where he'd gone. That night, as we sat around the fire trying to catch our breath, Redfeather spoke up again. "The Wendigo is spreading its hunger," he said quietly. "If we don't stop it soon, we shall all end up like Wright." "How do we stop it?" I asked desperately. Redfeather looked at me with a serious expression. "We perform the ritual." The cabin felt colder than ever that night. Even with the fire burning, it was like the chill had seeped into our bones. None of us spoke much after what happened with Wright. Peterson sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, her face pale and her hands trembling. Red Feather was focused on preparing for the ritual, carefully drawing symbols on the floor with ash and charcoal. I tried to help him, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the chalk. "What happens if this doesn't work?" I asked quietly. Red Feather paused for a moment before answering. "Then we don't make it through the night." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight. I didn't know what scared me more, the thought of facing the Wendigo or the possibility that we might already be too late. As midnight approached, Red Feather finished drawing the symbols and lit a small fire in the center of the room using a bundle of sage and cedar. The smoke filled the cabin with a sharp, earthy smell that seemed to cut through the icy air. "This will keep it out for now," he said, gesturing to the symbols around us, "but we need to lure it closer if we set going to stop it." "How do we do that?" Peterson asked nervously. Red Feather looked at me. "It's been calling your name," he said. "It wants you." I felt my stomach twist. "You want me to go out there?" "No," Red Feather said firmly, "but you need to speak to it. Call it here." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious? What if it gets inside?" "It one step," he said confidently. "As long as we stay inside this circle, we such safe." I wasn't so sure about that, but I didn't have a better plan, so I took a deep breath, stepped to the edge of the circle, and shouted into the night. "Come on," I yelled, my voice cracking slightly. "I know you sitter out there, show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly, I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder with every step. "It's coming," Red Feather said calmly. Peterson grabbed my arm and pulled me back into the circle as we all stared at the door. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment, everything was still. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap on the wood, but it quickly grew louder and more insistent until it sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. "Michael." A voice called from outside. It was my wife Sip's voice again, soft and pleading, just like before. "Michael, please let me in." I clenched my fists and forced myself to stay where I was. "You're not her," I shouted back. The voice changed instantly, becoming deeper and more guttural, like an animal growling through clenched teeth. "Let me in," it roared. The door shook violently as something slammed against it over and over again. Peterson screamed and covered her ears while Red Feather began chanting softly under his breath, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as one of the windows shattered. A freezing gust of wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing our fire and plunging us into darkness. "It's Seps inside," Peterson screamed. "Stay in the circle." Red Feather shouted back. I could barely see anything in the dim light from our lanterns, but I could feel its presence cold and heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The air around us seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy that made my skin crawl. Then I saw it. The Wendigo stood just beyond our circle of protection, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was filled with sharp teeth that gleamed as it snarled at us. "It can sit across the circle," Red Feather said firmly. "As long as we stay here, we steer safe." But then Peterson did something none of us expected. She stepped out of the circle. "Peterson!" "No," I shouted, reaching for her. But it was too late. She turned to look at me with tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered before walking toward the Wendigo. The creature let out a low growl as she approached it, its hollow eyes locked onto her like a predator watching its prey. For a moment, she just stood there in front of it, frozen in place, before it lunged forward and grabbed her by the shoulders. Her scream echoed through the cabin as they both disappeared into the darkness outside. "No," I yelled, starting to run after her, but Red Feather grabbed my arm and pulled me back into the circle. "There's nothing you can do for her now," he said quietly. I wanted to argue with him, to fight back, but deep down I knew he was right. For what felt like hours after that, we stayed huddled inside our circle, while Red Feather continued his chants. The Wendigo circled us like a wolf stalking its prey, snarling and clawing at our barriers but never crossing them. Finally, as dawn began to break over the horizon, Redfeather finished his ritual with one final chant that sent a wave of heat through the cabin like an explosion of firelight. The Wendigo let out an ear-piercing scream before vanishing into thin air, leaving behind nothing but silence and frost-covered walls. "It's gone," Redfeather said quietly, as he slumped to his knees in exhaustion. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over, that somewhere out there in those frozen woods, it was still waiting for its next victim. My name is Catherine Norwood, but most people just call me Kate. I'm a park ranger and glaciologist stationed in Denali National Park, Alaska. It's a lonely job, but that's kind of the point. Out here, surrounded by snow and ice, I can forget about the world, or at least try to. 3 years ago, my life fell apart. My ex-husband and my son died in a climbing accident. They were scaling a peak in Colorado when the weather turned bad. I wasn't there, I was here, studying glaciers, and I've spent every day since wondering if I could have saved them if I'd been with them. That guilt clings to me like frostbite. So now I bury myself in my work, far away from anyone who might care about me. It's early spring 1976, and the winter thaw has come faster than anyone expected. The snow is melting at record speed, exposing strange ice formations across the valley. This morning, I was out photographing one of these formations, tall spires of ice that looked like frozen waves crashing toward the sky. The patterns were unlike anything I'd seen before, almost unnatural. I live alone in a tiny research station perched on the edge of a glacier. My days are spent collecting ice core samples and monitoring wildlife migration patterns. The only human voices I hear are over the radio. Marcus Holden, the park's radio operator, checks in every evening to make sure I'm still alive. Jack Ryder, the helicopter pilot, drops off supplies once a month, and Enyu Takakak, an indigenous guide who sometimes visits to share his knowledge of the land. Marcus is friendly enough, always cracking jokes to lighten my mood, but he doesn't understand why I stay out here alone. Jack is more practical. He delivers what I need and doesn't ask questions. Enyu is different. He speaks softly, but carries an air of wisdom that makes you listen when he talks. He once told me that these mountains have secrets older than time itself. As the days grow warmer, something feels off. The air smells different, sharp and metallic, and the animals seem restless. Yesterday I noticed that the valley was unusually quiet. No birds chirping, no foxes darting across the snow. Even the caribou herds that usually pass through this time of year are nowhere to be seen. I try not to let it bother me. After all, nature is unpredictable. Things change all the time. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. The thaw continued over the next few days, and the glacier seemed to be shedding its icy skin faster than I'd ever seen. I spent most of my time hiking through the valley, documenting the changes. On the third day, something unusual caught my eye, a dark shape buried deep in the ice near the edge of the glacier. At first, I thought it was just a fallen tree, or maybe a large rock, but as I got closer, I realized it was neither. It was an animal, or at least it looked like one. The carcass was massive, bigger than any bear or moose I'd ever seen. Its body was twisted in a way that made my stomach turn, and its skin had a strange bluish tint that shimmered under the sunlight. I crouched down and started taking photos, my hands trembling as I adjusted the focus on my camera. The creature's features didn't make sense. Its limbs were long and muscular, ending in sharp claws that looked like they could tear through steel. Its head was broad, with deep-set eyes and teeth that reminded me of a wolf's, except much larger. I couldn't tell how old it was or how long it had been frozen in the ice. All I knew was that it wasn't something anyone had ever seen before. My heart raced as I thought about what this discovery could mean for science, for history. I radioed Marcus to tell him about what I found. His voice crackled through the static, calm but curious. "Sounds like you got yourself a mystery there, Kate," he said. "You sure it's not just some weird bear?" "No," I replied firmly. "This isn't a bear, it's something else." Marcus promised to alert the park service and send someone out to investigate, but with the thaw accelerating and resources stretched thin, I knew it could take days for anyone to arrive. That night, as I sat alone in my station reviewing the photos on my camera, I heard something outside, a low rumbling sound that made the walls vibrate. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up speed, but then I heard it again, a deep guttural noise that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the area around the station. The snow reflected the beam of light back at me, making it hard to see anything clearly. But then I noticed something, tracks leading away from where I'd found the carcass earlier that day. The tracks were massive, each one at least twice the size of my boot prints. They weren't there when I left earlier. They had appeared since then. My stomach tightened as I followed them across the ice field, trying to make sense of what could have made them. The carcass was gone. I stood there staring at the empty spot where it had been frozen into the glacier just hours ago. The ice around it had melted unnaturally fast, leaving behind a pool of water that shimmered under the moonlight. The tracks led away from the spot and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the station's walls and every gust of wind made me jump. When Marcus called in for his nightly check-in, I told him about what had happened. "Kate," he said slowly, his voice more serious than usual, "you need to be careful out there." "I know," I replied quietly. The next morning, Inu arrived unexpectedly at my station. He rarely came out this far unless he had something important to share. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke. "You found something," he said simply. I nodded and showed him one of the photos of the creature's carcass on my camera screen. He stared at it for a long time before speaking again. "That Seps Tornet?" he said finally. "Tornet?" I asked. "That's an old story," Enu explained. "My people believed they were predators long ago, giants who lived in ice and hunted during warm seasons before going back to sleep when winter came. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, just another legend passed down through generations, but something about his tone made me hesitate. He wasn't telling me this for fun, he was warning me. Before leaving, Inu looked me straight in the eye and said one last thing: "Be ready." The next few days were a blur of tension and unease. I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, or Tornet, as Enu had called it. The tracks I'd found still haunted me, and the eerie silence in the valley only made things worse. It felt like the entire landscape was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to focus on my work, but even that didn't feel normal anymore. The wildlife was still gone, and the weather had taken a strange turn. Sudden gusts of icy wind would sweep through the valley out of nowhere, and at night I'd hear faint noises, scraping sounds like claws dragging across ice. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. Then, one evening, I saw it. I was outside collecting snow samples when I spotted movement on the far side of the glacier. At first, it was just a shadow, something tall and thin moving between the ice formations. My heart started pounding as I raised my binoculars to get a closer look. There it was. The creature stood at least 12 feet tall, its bluish skin almost glowing against the white snow. Its body was lean but powerful, with long arms that ended in sharp claws. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the ice as if it weighed nothing at all. For a moment, it stopped and turned its head in my direction. I froze, barely breathing, as its deep-set eyes scanned the area. I don't know if it saw me or not, but after a few seconds it disappeared into the shadows again so fast that I almost doubted what I'd seen. Almost. I ran back to the station and locked every door and window. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the radio working. "Marcus," I said as soon as he answered, "it sits alive." There was a long pause on the other end before he replied. "What do you mean, set alive, Sept?" "The creature," I whispered. "The one from the ice, it seps awake." Marcus tried to calm me down, but there wasn't much he could do from miles away. He promised to send help as soon as possible, but with the thaw causing chaos across the park, I knew it could take days for anyone to reach me. That night was worse than any before. The noises outside grew louder, scraping sounds mixed with low growls that seemed to come from all directions. At one point, I heard something tapping on the walls of the station in a steady rhythm like Morse code. It didn't make any sense, but it sent chills down my spine. The next morning brought more bad news. Jack Ryder's helicopter crashed while trying to deliver supplies to another station nearby. When rescuers found him hours later, he was barely alive and suffering from severe frostbite. According to Marcus, Jack kept muttering about ice that moves and a storm with eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to Jack was connected to the creature and that it wasn't done yet. Desperate for answers, I decided to explore some nearby ice caves that Enu had mentioned during one of his visits. He'd told me they were sacred places where his ancestors once sought shelter during harsh winters. If Tornet was part of their stories, maybe there was something in those caves that could help me understand what I was dealing with. The caves were cold and silent, their walls glittering with frozen crystals that reflected my flashlight's beam like tiny stars. As I ventured deeper inside, I stumbled upon something horrifying, human remains frozen into the ice. There were dozens of them. Men, women, even children, all perfectly preserved as if they'd been trapped there for centuries. Their faces were twisted in expressions of terror, their bodies huddled together as if trying to escape some unseen threat. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what this meant. Tornet wasn't just a legend, it had been hunting people for generations, and now it was awake again. Before leaving the cave, I noticed something else. Strange markings carved into the walls near the bodies. They looked like warnings or symbols meant to keep something away, but whatever they were meant to protect against hadn't stayed gone for long. As I made my way back to the station, a single thought kept running through my mind. If this thing had survived for centuries in the ice, how many more like it were still out there? The valley felt like it was closing in on me. The creature was out there somewhere, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it came closer. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Annie returned to the station the next morning. His face grim. He carried a folder filled with old yellowed documents, government records from 1943. According to him, a similar incident had occurred during military exercises in the area. Soldiers had reported strange sightings and unexplained deaths. The files described massive footprints and sudden blizzards that appeared out of nowhere, leaving entire squads frozen to death. They tried to fight it, Inu said quietly, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. The creature, Tornet, or the Frostwalker, as the records called it, wasn't just a predator, it was something beyond that, something ancient and relentless. The documents suggested that it woke during warm periods, hunting to prepare for its next hibernation cycle. It hunted not just for food, but for survival. I asked Ennio if there was any way to stop it. He hesitated before answering. Heat, he said finally, and salt. Apparently, the creature's body couldn't withstand high temperatures or saline solutions. They disrupted its cellular structure. It wasn't much, but it was something. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to wait for help. I was going to fight back. I spent the rest of the day rigging heating elements around the station's perimeter, creating a thermal barrier. It wasn't perfect, but it might buy me some time if the creature attacked. I also filled buckets with salt water and placed them near every entrance. Marcus called in that evening as usual, his voice steady despite my growing panic. "Kate," he said, "you need to get out of there." "I can sit," I replied firmly. "If this thing gets out of the valley, who knows what it's still do." Marcus didn't argue, but I could hear the worry in his voice as he signed off. That night, the storm came. It started with a low rumble that shook the station's walls, then the wind picked up speed, howling like a wild animal. Snow slammed against the windows in thick sheets, making it impossible to see outside. The temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on the inside of the glass. I stayed close to the heating controls, watching for any sign of movement outside. Hours passed in tense silence until suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the station. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. The back door had been ripped off its hinges, and snow was pouring into the hallway like an avalanche. In the middle of it stood Marcus, his face pale and frozen with terror. Before I could say anything, he collapsed onto the floor, his breath coming out in ragged gasps. His skin was covered in frostbite, and his eyes were wide with fear. "It's here," he whispered hoarsely before his body went still. I barely had time to process what had happened before another crash echoed through the station, this time from the front door. The creature was inside. I ran toward the boiler room, my mind racing with panic and adrenaline. If I could lure it into the room and trap it there, maybe I could use the heat to weaken it or kill it. The creature followed me through the hallways, its guttural growls echoing off the walls. It moved faster than I expected, its translucent skin blending into the snow-covered floors and walls like camouflage. Every time I thought I'd lost it, it reappeared just feet behind me. Finally, I reached the boiler room and slammed the door shut behind me. The heat inside was stifling, steam hissed from pipes and radiators as temperatures climbed higher and higher. The creature burst through the door moments later, its claws slicing through metal like paper. It roared in anger as the heat hit its skin, causing parts of its body to shimmer and dissolve like melting ice. I grabbed one of the buckets of salt water and hurled it at the creature with all my strength. The liquid splashed across its chest, causing it to let out an ear-piercing scream as chunks of its body dissolved into puddles on the floor. It lunged at me one last time before collapsing onto its knees, its body slowly disintegrating under the combined force of heat and salt water. When it finally stopped moving, I sank to my knees in exhaustion and relief. The station was eerily quiet after the battle. The creature's remains had melted into the floor, leaving behind nothing but a puddle of water and faint traces of frost. The heat from the boiler room had done its job, but the victory felt hollow. Marcus was gone. His lifeless body lay in the hallway, his face frozen in fear. I couldn't stop replaying his last words in my head. "It's here." He had come to warn me, and it had cost him his life. Jack Ryder was still alive, but barely. The rescue team finally reached him the next morning, pulling him from the wreckage of his helicopter. His injuries were severe. Frostbite had taken most of his fingers, and he couldn't stop mumbling about the ice that moves. He wouldn't be flying again anytime soon. As for Enyu, he had vanished during the storm. I searched for him for hours after the creature was gone, but there was no sign of him anywhere. It was as if the snow had swallowed him whole. I hoped he had made it back to safety, but deep down I feared the worst. The Park Service arrived a few days later to investigate. I told them everything, the creature, the tracks, Marcus's death, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it all up to equipment failure and exposure to extreme weather conditions. The official report listed Marcus's death as an accident and Jack's injuries as a result of the crash. They ordered me to evacuate the station immediately, but I refused. I couldn't leave, not yet. Before they left, I showed them something I'd found near the glacier, tiny embryonic ice formations scattered across the valley floor. They looked harmless at first glance, but when I examined them closely under a microscope, I saw something chilling, microscopic cells that resembled those of the creature. It wasn't set over. The warming temperatures were waking more of them, and it was only a matter of time before they emerged from the ice like their predecessor. Someone needed to stay behind to monitor the thaw to prepare for what was coming. As the rescue team drove away, I stood alone on the edge of the glacier, staring out at the vast expanse of snow and ice. The wind howled around me, carrying with it a faint echo of something primal and ancient. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. My name is Robert Thornton, but most people call me Bobby. I'm 42 years old, a former Marine sniper, and I've seen things that would make most men crumble. Vietnam took a lot from me, my friends, my peace of mind, and parts of myself I'll never get back. After losing my spotter to friendly fire, I left the military and came here to the Stanislaus National Forest in California. This place was supposed to be my escape, a quiet job as a ranger where I could lose myself in the wilderness and forget the ghosts that haunt me. It was early summer in 1968 when I arrived at Ponderosa Station, an old cabin surrounded by towering pines and endless silence. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and for a moment, I thought maybe this place could heal me. But the forest had other plans. Walter Green, my supervisor, was waiting for me when I arrived. He was a gruff man in his 50s, a Korean War veteran who didn't believe in nonsense. "We've had some hikers go missing in the western quadrant," he said, as we stood outside the cabin. "Bears, probably. Just keep your eyes open." I nodded, but didn't say much. Green respected my instincts, but he didn't understand me. Not really. No one did. Jeffrey Collins was assigned as my assistant. He was young, barely 25, with bright eyes full of enthusiasm. He reminded me of the kids who signed up for Vietnam thinking it would be an adventure. Collins wanted to learn everything from me, but he didn't realize how heavy that knowledge could be. I spent the first few days settling into a routine, patrolling the trails with Duke, my German shepherd, documenting wildlife movements and keeping an eye on tourists who wandered too far off the beaten path. Duke was more than just a dog. He was my partner, trained to detect danger before it even showed its face. One morning during patrol, I noticed something strange, a section of the forest that was completely silent. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Duke's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. Later that day, local hunters stopped by the station to report unusual animal migrations away from the western ridges. They said deer were moving farther east than they'd ever seen before. Something was wrong. The next morning, Collins and I went deeper into the forest to investigate. That's when I found them tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were massive, about 18 inches long, with strange spacing between them. Whatever made them wasn't human or any animal I knew. Maria Vasquez showed up at the station later that evening. She was a local guide whose family had lived in this region for generations. Maria wasn't like Green. She believed in things most people dismissed as superstition. She warned me about entering the Shadow Valley during the summer solstice. "Bad things happen there," she said quietly, her dark eyes full of worry. I didn't believe in supernatural explanations, but Maria's fear felt real enough to make me pause. The next day during patrol, Duke led me to something horrifying, a mutilated deer carcass suspended 20 feet up in a tree. Its body had been drained of blood with surgical precision, and its entrails hung like decorations around the branches. I stared at it for what felt like hours before Collins broke the silence. "What kind of animal could do this?" he asked nervously. I didn't answer him because deep down I knew this wasn't any ordinary animal. After finding the deer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The forest didn't feel alive anymore. It felt like a trap. Collins was quiet on the way back to the station, and Duke stayed close to my side, his tail low and his ears constantly twitching. That night, I sat in the cabin, staring at the map of the western quadrant. Green had marked the spots where hikers had gone missing. They all seemed to cluster around one area, a place Maria had called the Shadow Valley. I didn't believe in her stories about curses or spirits, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. Something was out there. The next morning, Collins and I headed to an abandoned campsite reported by a group of hunters. When we arrived, it was eerie. The campfire was still smoldering, and food sat untouched on a picnic table. The tents were intact, but there was no sign of the people who had been there. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. "Do you think it's bears?" Collins asked, his voice shaky. "Bears don't leave campsites like this," I replied, scanning the area for clues. Duke sniffed around but suddenly stopped near a cluster of rocks. He growled low and deep, refusing to go any closer. I crouched down to examine the rocks and found something strange, scratches that looked deliberate, almost like symbols. They didn't resemble anything I'd seen before. As we walked back to the station, our radios started acting up. Static crackled through the speakers. But underneath it, I heard something odd. Harmonics that sounded like faint whispers or distant humming. Collins tried adjusting his radio, but nothing worked. That night, things got worse. Duke refused to sleep near the door like he usually did and instead curled up under my bed, trembling. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside, a melodic howling that echoed through the valley. It wasn't an animal, it sounded almost human but distorted, like someone singing underwater. The next day during patrol, we found another strange sight. Birds flying in unnatural patterns, circling above us as if they were confused or scared. Nocturnal animals were active during daylight hours, darting through the trees like they were trying to escape something. Collins stumbled upon something that made my stomach turn: ancient petroglyphs carved into a rock face deep in the forest. They depicted winged humanoid figures hunting primitive humans. The carvings were older than anything that should have been in this area. Maria visited us again that evening and told us more about her family's stories. She called the creature the one who walks between stars. According to legend, it fell from the sky during meteor showers and hibernated for decades before awakening when disturbed by human activity. I didn't want to believe her stories, but they lined up with what we'd seen: the tracks, the carcass in the tree, and now these carvings. Later that week, Duke led me to a cave entrance, hidden behind dense brush near the western ridges. Inside were paintings that didn't make sense. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs and wings hunting animals and humans alike. They were impossibly old. Standing there in that cave with Duke growling beside me, I finally admitted it: whatever we were dealing with wasn't natural. The cave haunted me. Those ancient paintings weren't just art. They felt like warnings. I couldn't stop thinking about them as we returned to the station. Collins was unusually quiet, and Duke stayed close, his eyes darting toward every shadow. That night, Green sent a team of 4 additional rangers to help with the investigation. They brought modern equipment, thermal cameras, motion detectors, and radios, but none of it made me feel safer. Green still thought it was a bear, or maybe a mountain lion. I didn't argue with him, but in my gut, I knew better. Collins volunteered for night patrol that evening. I didn't want to let him go alone, but Green insisted we split into teams to cover more ground. I gave Collins my flashlight and told him to stick to the trails. "If anything feels off, you call me right away," I said. He nodded nervously and headed out with one of the other rangers. Hours passed, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. Around midnight, Collins' voice crackled over the radio. "Thornton, I think I see something," he whispered. "What is it?" I asked, grabbing my gear. There was a long pause before he replied. "It sets tall, it sets not moving. Stay where you are." "I'm coming to you," I said. But before I could leave, his voice cut through the static again, this time screaming. It wasn't just fear, it was pure terror. Then silence. I ran into the woods with Duke leading the way. The other rangers followed behind me, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. When we reached Collins' last known location, all we found were his scattered belongings: a flashlight here, a boot there, and a blood trail that defied logic. It went straight up a tree trunk and disappeared into the canopy. One of the rangers muttered something about calling for backup, but Green shook his head. "We don't need more people getting lost out here," he said firmly. The next day, Maria came to the station again. She looked pale and shaken as she told us about her grandmother Sip's encounter with the creature back in 1935. She said it could mimic voices. Maria explained. It would call out in the voice of someone you love to lure you closer. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, because I hadn't told anyone about what happened earlier that morning. While searching for Collins, I'd heard a voice calling my name from deep in the forest, a voice that sounded exactly like my spotter from Vietnam. He'd been dead for years. Later that afternoon, we found something even more disturbing: a subterranean chamber hidden beneath a rockslide near the western ridges. Inside were human remains preserved in what looked like cocoon-like structures. Some of them were decades old, others were so fresh they couldn't have been there more than a few weeks. The air in that chamber felt heavy, almost alive, and as we stood there staring at those remains, I felt something shift in the atmosphere, like we weren't alone. That night, Green finally admitted he didn't think this was just a bear anymore. "Whatever it is," he said gruffly, "it seemed smart." I spent hours going over everything we'd found, the tracks, the carvings, Maria's stories, and realized there was a pattern. The creature's appearances seemed to line up with phases of the moon and meteor showers every 33 years. It wasn't random, it was calculated. Maria suggested using rituals to protect ourselves before going any further into its territory. Green dismissed her ideas as superstition, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. As we prepared for another search mission, Duke started acting strange again, whining and pacing near the door like he knew something bad was coming. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The next morning, we prepared to head deeper into the western quadrant. Maria arrived early with bundles of herbs and symbols drawn on scraps of paper. She handed them out to each of us, saying they would protect us from the creature. Green rolled his eyes but didn't stop her. I tucked mine into my pocket, not because I believed in it, but because I didn't want to offend her. The Rangers set up motion-activated cameras and recording equipment around the area where Collins had disappeared. They were hoping to catch something, anything that could explain what was happening. But even with all their gear, I didn't feel safe. Duke stayed close to me, his ears twitching at every sound. As we moved through the forest, the air grew colder. It didn't make sense. It was summer, and the sun was high in the sky, but I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The trees seemed taller somehow, their shadows stretching unnaturally long across the ground. Maria stopped suddenly and pointed to a cluster of rocks ahead. "That's where my grandmother saw it," she said quietly. We approached cautiously, and Duke let out a low growl. The rocks were covered in strange markings, symbols similar to the ones I'd seen near the abandoned campsite. The air felt heavy again, like something was pressing down on us. One of the Rangers called out from a few yards away. "I found something," he shouted. We hurried over and found him standing at the entrance to another cave. Inside were more cocoon-like structures, but this time they were empty, just dried husks hanging from the walls like grotesque decorations. "Looks like it's been using these for years," Green muttered, his face pale. As we explored deeper into the cave network, I started feeling strange, like time was slipping away from me. One moment I was walking behind Maria, the next I was standing alone in a dark tunnel with no idea how I'd gotten there. My head was pounding, and my vision blurred as flashes of Vietnam played in my mind, gunfire, explosions, my spotter's voice screaming for help. Duke found me before anyone else did. He nudged my hand and barked until I snapped out of it. When Maria and Green finally caught up with me, they looked worried. "It's Sep's messing with you," Maria said softly. "That Sep's how it hunts." I didn't argue because I knew she was right. That evening, we gathered at a base camp near the western ridges. Green insisted we keep constant radio contact and stay within sight of each other at all times. Maria performed another ritual around the campfire, scattering herbs and chanting softly under her breath. As night fell, the melodic howling returned closer this time. It echoed through the valley like a song meant to lure us in. Duke stood rigid beside me, his ears pinned back and his teeth bared. One of the motion cameras triggered just after midnight. The screen showed a massive silhouette moving through the trees, a winged figure with elongated limbs that seemed to glide rather than walk. Its translucent skin glowed faintly under the moonlight, revealing pulsating organs inside its body. Green stared at the screen in disbelief. "That's not possible," he whispered. But it was real, and it was hunting us. The forest was alive with tension. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, made my heart race. We knew it was out there, watching us. The cameras had confirmed it, but seeing that thing on a screen wasn't the same as knowing it was somewhere in the darkness, waiting. Green ordered us to stay close together as we moved toward the cave network. Maria carried her herbs and symbols, muttering prayers under her breath. Duke stayed ahead of me, sniffing the ground and growling softly. His behavior told me everything I needed to know. The creature was nearby. We didn't have to wait long. The first attack came just after midnight. One of the Rangers screamed, and by the time we turned our flashlights in his direction, he was gone. His gear was scattered on the ground, and blood dripped from the branches above us. The trees seemed to swallow him whole. "Stay together," Green barked, his voice shaking. But it didn't matter. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. It darted between the trees, its massive wings spreading like shadows against the moonlight. Its movements were almost hypnotic, smooth and silent, like it wasn't bound by gravity. Then I saw it up close for the first time. It stepped into the beam of my flashlight, and my breath caught in my throat. It was worse than anything I'd imagined, tall and skeletal with translucent skin that pulsed faintly as if its entire body was alive. Its face had no eyes, just slits where ears might have been, and its jaw unhinged as it let out a sound that made my chest vibrate. It wasn't a roar, it was something deeper, something that rattled my bones and filled my head with whispers. Duke lunged at it without hesitation, barking furiously. The creature swatted him aside like he weighed nothing. He hit the ground hard but got back up, limping slightly as he growled at the thing. "Thornton, over here," Maria shouted, pulling me out of my trance. She had drawn a circle on the ground with her herbs and symbols. "It won't cross this," she yelled. I grabbed Duke and dragged him into the circle. Just as the creature lunged toward us, it stopped short, hissing angrily as if an invisible barrier was holding it back. Maria's rituals were working for now, but we couldn't stay there forever. Green and the remaining rangers regrouped near us, their faces pale with fear. "We need to trap it," Green said through gritted teeth. "If we don't stop it here, more people are going to die." I remembered something Maria had said earlier about sound, how high frequencies might hurt it because of its sensitive hearing. I grabbed one of our radios and started fiddling with the settings, cranking up the frequency until it emitted a piercing tone that made even my ears ache. The creature recoiled instantly, screeching in pain as it covered its head with those long, spindly arms. "It's working," Colin shouted from behind me. Using the radio as a weapon, we drove it back toward the caves. It moved erratically now, stumbling and flapping its wings in an attempt to escape the sound. Duke barked furiously beside me, his courage giving me strength as we pushed forward. When we reached the entrance to the cave network, Green handed me a stick of dynamite from his pack, the kind we used for clearing fallen trees after storms. "You're the best shot we've got," he said grimly. I nodded and took it without hesitation. The creature disappeared into the darkness of the cave, but I could still hear its guttural growls echoing off the walls. I followed cautiously, holding Duke back as he tried to charge ahead. The air inside was thick and suffocating, filled with a smell like rotting meat. Finally, I saw it crouched at the end of a narrow tunnel, a grotesque mass of wings and limbs hunched over like it was trying to recover from our attack. This was my chance. I lit the fuse on the dynamite and threw it with everything I had. The stick landed near its feet just as it turned toward me, its jaw unhinging in another ear-splitting screech. "Run!" I shouted to everyone behind me as I grabbed Duke and bolted for the exit. The explosion rocked the ground beneath us, sending dirt and debris flying through the air. The tunnel collapsed in on itself, sealing whatever was left of that creature inside. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a distant howl echoed through the forest, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't dead, not yet, but at least for now it was trapped. The forest was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of peaceful silence I'd come to love. This silence felt heavy, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The others and I stood outside the collapsed cave, covered in dirt and sweat, staring at the rubble. No one said a word. Duke sat beside me, his ears pinned back and his body tense. He didn't wag his tail or look relieved. He just stared at the cave entrance, growling softly under his breath. I reached down to scratch behind his ears, but he didn't react. He knew it wasn't over. Green broke the silence first. "We still file the report as a bear attack," he said gruffly, wiping his face with a dirty handkerchief. "No one's going to believe us if we tell them the truth." I didn't argue. What could we say? That a 9-foot-tall creature with wings and translucent skin had been hunting people in the forest. They'd laugh us out of the room, or worse, send more people into its territory. Collins was alive, but barely. We found him cocooned in one of the caves before the explosion, his body weak and his mind shattered. He couldn't speak, just stared blankly at the ground like he was trapped in some nightmare he couldn't escape. We carried him back to the station, but I wasn't sure he'd ever recover. Maria stayed behind for a while, performing one last ritual near the collapsed cave. She didn't say much, just murmured prayers in a language I didn't understand. When she finished, She walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Itzep's not dead," she said softly. "Itzep's just sleeping." I nodded because I already knew that deep down, the explosion hadn't killed it. It had only bought us time. Over the next few days, we cleaned up what we could and tried to move on. Green filed his report as planned: bear attacks and a cave collapse caused by unstable ground. The families of the missing hikers got their answers, just not the real ones. I stayed at Ponderosa Station after that. Green offered to transfer me somewhere else, but I refused. Someone needed to stay here and keep an eye on that cave to make sure no one disturbed it again. Before Maria left, she gave me one last warning: it will wake up again when Itzep's ready. Maybe not in our lifetime, but someday. I spent my days setting up seismic monitors near the collapsed cave and marking maps with everything we'd learned about its patterns, the moon phases, the meteor showers, all of it. I wanted to be ready if it ever came back. One night, weeks after everything had happened, I sat alone in the cabin with Duke at my feet. The calendar on the wall caught my eye. 33 years from now would be 2001. I circled the date without even thinking about it. As I stared at that circle on the calendar, I heard something outside, a faint howl that sent chills down my spine. It sounded just like Duke's bark, but Duke was lying right there beside me. He lifted his head and looked toward the door, his ears perking up as if he'd heard it too. I didn't move for a long time after that. My name is Robert Thornton, but everyone just calls me Bobby. I'm a park ranger stationed deep in the Stanislaus National Forest in California. I've been here for a few months now, living in a small weathered cabin surrounded by towering ponderosa pines. It's quiet out here. Peaceful. That's exactly what I was looking for, a place to escape from the noise in my head. You see, before this, I was a Marine sniper in Vietnam. I don't talk about it much, but I lost my spotter out there. Friendly fire. They called it a mistake, but it didn't feel like a mistake to me. It felt like my fault. Ever since that day, I've been carrying this weight, this guilt that never seems to go away. The wilderness seemed like the only place where I could breathe again. So here I am, spending my days patrolling the forest trails, documenting plants and wildlife, and working with a small team of seasonal rangers. There's Jeffrey Collins. He's young, maybe 25, and full of energy. He's the kind of guy who still thinks he can change the world. Then there's Maria Vasquez, a local guide whose family has lived in this area for generations. She knows these woods better than anyone. And finally, there's Duke, my German shepherd and best friend. He's trained to detect predators and keeps me grounded when my mind starts drifting back to darker places. The days are simple here. Wake up early, check the trails, make sure campers aren't causing trouble, and keep an eye on the wildlife. It's not exciting work, but it's honest and quiet, just what I need. But even in the quietest places, trouble has a way of finding you. It started with something strange, something I couldn't explain. One morning, while out on patrol with Duke, I found a deer carcass. Now, finding dead animals in the forest isn't unusual. Predators hunt, and nature takes its course. But this was different. The deer wasn't just dead, it was mutilated. Its body was hanging 20 feet up in a tree, like someone or something had placed it there on purpose. Its throat was cut clean and there wasn't a drop of blood anywhere. The cuts were too precise to be from an animal. It looked surgical. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Duke growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back. He didn't like it either. I radioed Jeffrey to come take a look, and when he arrived, he just stood there, wide-eyed and pale. "What could have done this?" he asked. "I don't know," I said quietly. And I didn't, but something about it made my skin crawl. That was just the beginning. A few days later, we started hearing reports over the radio about hikers going missing in the western part of the forest. 3 separate groups had vanished without a trace, leaving behind abandoned campsites and scattered belongings. Maria came by the station one evening to talk about it. She looked uneasy, which wasn't like her at all. "There's something wrong in that part of the forest," she said. "My family has always avoided it. We don't set go there, not even to hunt. Why not? I asked. She hesitated before answering. There are stories, old stories about things that live out there, things that aren't sit natural. I didn't press her for details. Maria wasn't the kind of person to scare easily, and if she was worried, then maybe I should be too. As the days went on, more strange things started happening. The wildlife wasn't acting right, birds flying in strange patterns, squirrels abandoning their nests, even bears keeping their distance from certain areas. At night, the temperature would drop suddenly, so cold that frost would form on the windows of my cabin, even though it was the middle of summer. And then there was the sound. It started at sunset, a low melodic howling that echoed through the valley. It wasn't wolves or coyotes. I knew those sounds well enough to tell the difference. This was something else entirely. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I heard it. One evening, while patrolling near the western quadrant with Jeffrey, we came across footprints near an abandoned campsite. They were massive, 18 inches long, and unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They looked almost human but were too big and had an odd shape to them, like whoever or whatever made them didn't walk quite right. Jeffrey tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was scared. Maybe Bigfoot's real after all, he joked nervously. But I wasn't laughing. The final straw came when I stumbled upon a cave entrance hidden behind some thick brush during one of my patrols. Something about it felt wrong. The air around it was colder than anywhere else in the forest, and when I stepped inside with my flashlight, I found something that sent chills down my spine: cave paintings. They were crude but clear. Figures of people running from a tall creature with wings spread wide like a bat's and an elongated face that didn't look human at all. My heart pounded as I stared at them, trying to convince myself they were just old stories carved into stone by people with overactive imaginations. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there in those woods, something ancient and dangerous. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, that the cave paintings were nothing more than old legends. But the forest had changed. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt empty, like something had chased everything away. Even Duke seemed on edge, his ears constantly twitching, his nose sniffing the air like he was searching for something. Then I saw it. It was just before dusk. I was hiking along a ridge near the western quadrant, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. Duke was ahead of me, his tail stiff and his movements cautious. That's when I heard it. A sound like bones snapping, loud and sharp. I froze and slowly turned toward the noise. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly: a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was crouched over a mountain lion, its wings folded tightly against its back. Its skin was translucent, glowing faintly in the fading sunlight, and I could see its organs pulsing inside its body. Its jaw hung open unnaturally wide as it swallowed chunks of flesh whole. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Duke let out a low growl, but I grabbed his collar and pulled him close to me, praying the creature wouldn't notice us. It finished its meal and stood up slowly, towering over the trees at nearly 9 feet tall. Its wings unfurled briefly before folding back again, and then it turned its head toward me. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow pits that seemed to pull in all the light around them. And then it made a sound, a low vibration that rattled my chest and made my vision blur. My knees buckled, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the trees, moving so fast that it seemed to dissolve into the shadows. I stumbled back to the cabin that night with Duke by my side, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it real? Or was my PTSD playing tricks on me again? But deep down, I knew this wasn't in my head. This was real, and it was dangerous. The next night, Jeffrey went missing. He had been out on patrol near the western quadrant when his radio went silent. Maria and I searched for him until dawn, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just his radio lying in the dirt transmitting static. That's when things got worse. The creature started playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just inside my head. Late at night, I'd hear voices outside my cabin, familiar voices calling my name. At first, I thought it was Jeffrey or one of the other rangers needing help, but when I stepped outside with my flashlight, there was no one there. Then one night, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years, the voice of my spotter from Vietnam. "Bobby," he called softly from the edge of the tree line. "It wasn't your fault." I froze in place, gripping Duke's leash tightly as he barked furiously at the darkness. My spotter had been dead for years, I knew that, but hearing his voice so clearly sent chills down my spine. The creature wasn't just hunting us, it was messing with our minds. Maria came to the cabin the next morning with an old leather journal in her hands. "You need to see this," she said quietly. The journal belonged to one of her ancestors, a Spanish settler who had lived in this area centuries ago. It described encounters with a creature they called El Caminante Nocturno, the Nightwalker. According to the journal, it appeared every 33 years during meteor showers and preyed on anything living in its territory. "It's not just hunting," Maria said as she flipped through the pages. "It's protecting something." "What?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "I don't still know." I couldn't sit back and do nothing anymore. Jeffrey was still missing, and the creature was getting bolder. Every night, the howling grew louder, closer. The voices it mimicked were more personal, more painful. It was like it knew exactly how to dig into my mind and twist the knife. I had to stop it, whatever it was. Maria stayed at the cabin that night, poring over her ancestors' journal while I tried to figure out a plan. According to the journal, the Nightwalker had one weakness: high-frequency sounds. It couldn't tolerate them, and they could disrupt its ability to hunt. That gave me an idea. I dug through the old equipment in the ranger station and found a portable radio transmitter. It wasn't much, but I figured I could modify it to emit a high-pitched frequency strong enough to drive the creature away, or at least weaken it. Maria helped me rig it up while Duke sat by my side, his eyes fixed on the door like he was waiting for something to come through. By the time we finished, it was almost midnight. The howling had started again, echoing through the valley like a warning. I strapped the transmitter to my back, grabbed my rifle and a handful of Vietnam-era flares I'd kept as souvenirs, and headed out into the forest with Duke by my side. Maria wanted to come with me, but I told her to stay behind. If something went wrong, someone needed to be here to call for help or cover up what happened. The trail leading to the cave felt different this time. Heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Duke walked ahead cautiously, his nose low to the ground as he sniffed for signs of danger. Every step felt like it was taking me closer to something I didn't want to face. When we reached the cave entrance, I hesitated. The cold air spilling out of it was sharper than before, cutting through my clothes like ice. Duke growled softly, but didn't stop moving forward. I followed him inside, gripping my rifle tightly as I scanned the darkness with my flashlight. The cave was bigger than I'd realized, a network of tunnels twisting deep into the earth. The walls were covered in more of those strange paintings, but this time they were fresher, brighter, and then I saw them. The remains. Bodies were scattered throughout the cavern, preserved in ways that didn't make sense. Some were centuries old, their skin dried and stretched tight over their bones. Others looked almost recent, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. My stomach turned as I realized Jeffrey might be among them. And then I heard it, the vibration. It started low at first, barely noticeable, but quickly grew stronger until it felt like my chest was going to explode. My flashlight flickered wildly as shadows danced across the walls, and suddenly, there it was. The Nightwalker. It unfolded itself from the darkness, like a nightmare come to life. Its wings stretched wide as it stepped toward me on elongated limbs that bent unnaturally at every joint. Its translucent skin glowed faintly in the light of my flares, revealing organs that pulsed with every movement. Duke barked furiously and lunged at the creature without hesitation. "No!" I shouted, but it was too late. The Nightwalker swatted him aside effortlessly with one wing, sending him crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Rage boiled inside me as I activated the transmitter and aimed it directly at the creature. A piercing sound filled the cavern, a high-pitched frequency that made my ears ring and sent waves of pain through my skull. The Nightwalker screeched loudly and stumbled backward, its movements jerky and disoriented. I didn't waste any time. I lit one of the flares and threw it toward the creature's feet, illuminating its grotesque form in bright red light. It screamed again, a sound so unnatural that it made every hair on my body stand on end and lunge toward me. I fired my rifle blindly as I backed toward the entrance, trying to keep enough distance between us while fumbling for another flare. Duke staggered back onto his feet despite his injuries and charged at the creature again with everything he had. This time, he managed to distract it long enough for me to light another flare and throw it directly at its wings. The creature shrieked in pain as its skin began to blister under the intense heat. "Come on," I shouted at Duke as I grabbed him by his collar and dragged him toward the entrance. With one final effort, I set off a bundle of dynamite near the mouth of the cave, the kind we used for controlled rock blasting during trail maintenance, and ran as fast as I could before it detonated. The explosion shook the ground beneath me as rocks collapsed inward, sealing off whatever horrors lay inside forever, or so I hoped. The forest was silent after the explosion, not the peaceful kind of silence I'd come to love, but a heavy, unnatural stillness, the kind that made you feel like something was watching, even though you couldn't see it. I sat there on the ground just outside the cave, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Duke lay beside me, his fur matted with blood and dirt. He was hurt bad, but he was alive. I ran my hand over his head, whispering, "Good boy, you're a good boy," as he let out a soft whine. He'd saved my life, twice, and I wasn't going to forget it. The cave entrance was completely sealed. Now, buried under tons of rock and dirt, whatever that thing was, it wasn't getting out anytime soon. At least, that's what I told myself. By the time I made it back to the cabin with Duke limping at my side, the sun was starting to rise. Maria was waiting for us on the porch, her face pale and worried. When she saw Duke's injuries and the state I was in, she didn't ask any questions. She just helped me get him inside and started cleaning his wounds. "What happened?" she finally asked once Duke was settled on a blanket near the fire. "Its set's gone," I said simply. "The cave is sealed." She nodded but did not look convinced. "And Jeffrey?" I shook my head. "I didn't find him." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. Later that day, we got word over the radio that Jeffrey had been found, alive but catatonic, wandering near one of the main trails several miles from where he'd disappeared. He didn't speak or respond to anyone, just stared blankly into space like his mind had been wiped clean. They took him to a hospital in town, but I wasn't sure if he'd ever recover. The Forest Service sent investigators to look into the explosion and the reports of missing hikers. Officially, they ruled it all as bear attacks and a rock slide caused by unstable terrain. They didn't want to hear about creatures with wings or strange howling in the night. And honestly, I didn't blame them. Some things are easier left unexplained, but I couldn't let it go. I requested a permanent assignment to the ranger station, telling them I wanted to stay and keep an eye on the area. They thought it was because of my guilt over losing Jeffrey, or maybe because I needed more time away from people, but that wasn't it. I stayed because I knew this wasn't set over. Maria's ancestors' journal said the Nightwalker appeared every 33 years during meteor showers. That meant it wasn't gone. It was just sleeping again, waiting for its next cycle. And when that time came, someone needed to be here to stop it. Before Maria left for good, she gave me her ancestors' journal and hugged me tightly. "Be careful," she said softly before walking away into the trees. Now, every day feels like a countdown. I've installed seismic monitors near the collapsed cave entrance and marked my calendar for 33 years from now. Most nights are quiet again, normal, but every once in a while, when the wind blows just right through the valley, I think I hear something faint in the distance. A low, melodic howling, and when I do, I sit by the fire with Duke at my feet and remind myself that some things never really go away. My name is William Hawkins, but everyone calls me Will. I'm a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. It's not just a job for me, it's my life. My family's been tied to this land for generations. My grandfather was a ranger here, and my dad followed in his footsteps. Now it's my turn. I know every trail, every tree, and every stream like the back of my hand. But this fall, something felt off. The drought had been dragging on for months, and the streams that usually ran clear and strong were nothing but dry beds of cracked earth. The forest was quieter than usual, almost too quiet. Even the animals seemed uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One morning, as I was walking along one of the older trails, I noticed something strange in one of the dried-up stream beds. The roots of the trees were exposed, but they didn't look normal. They twisted and curled in unnatural ways, almost like they were reaching for something or someone. Some of them even had patterns that looked like veins or circuits. I crouched down to get a closer look, but the sight made my skin crawl. I stood up quickly and shook it off. It's just the drought messing with things, I told myself, trying to sound convincing, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Later that day, I met up with Dr. Ellen Montgomery, the park historian. Ellen's been researching Appalachian folklore for years, and she knows more about this area's history than anyone else alive. She was tracking down old settler stories about strange happenings in the mountains, tales of people disappearing or seeing things that couldn't be explained. "Will," she said, as we walked along a trail together, "have you ever heard of the rooted one sips?" I raised an eyebrow at her. "The rooted one? Can Set say I have?" She nodded thoughtfully and adjusted her glasses. "It's an old legend from the settlers who first came here in the 1800s. They talked about something living deep in the forest, something connected to the roots of the trees." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like campfire stories to me." Ellen gave me a serious look. "Maybe, but there are too many accounts to ignore." Her words stuck with me as I went about my day, leading guided tours, clearing trails, and documenting how the drought was affecting the ecosystem. My daughter Lily was visiting for the summer, and she joined me on some of my rounds. She's 16 now, smart as a whip but stubborn as all get out, and she loves exploring the park as much as I do. That evening, Raymond Tucker stopped by my cabin. Raymond's a local hunter who knows these woods better than anyone else around here. He looked uneasy as he sat down at my kitchen table. "Something ain't right out there," he said quietly, his voice low and gravelly. I poured us both a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "What do you mean?" "The animals," he said after a pause. "They are acting strange, spooked, like they are running from something." I frowned. Could be the drought messing with their food sources. Raymond shook his head firmly. "No, it's more than that." He leaned forward and lowered his voice even more. "I saw tracks near one of the old sinkholes, tracks I ain't ever seen before." I felt a chill run down my spine but tried to play it cool. "What kind of tracks?" Raymond hesitated before answering. "Big ones, like roots dragging across the ground." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded slowly and took another sip of coffee. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about what Raymond had said, or about those strange root structures I'd seen earlier in the day. Something wasn't set right in these woods. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just the drought. The next morning started like any other. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and the air had that crisp bite that comes with fall mornings. I grabbed my gear and headed out early, hoping to clear my head. But the uneasy feeling from last night hadn't gone away. It was only growing stronger. I decided to check out the area Raymond had mentioned. It was an older part of the park, far from the usual hiking trails. The drought had hit this section hard, leaving the ground cracked and brittle. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The trees here didn't look healthy. Their bark was peeling, their leaves were shriveled, and their roots seemed restless. Some of them were poking out of the ground like they were trying to escape. About an hour into my hike, I heard a low rumble under my feet. It wasn't loud, just enough to make me stop in my tracks. Then, without warning, the ground gave way. I scrambled back as a sinkhole opened up right in front of me. Dirt and rocks tumbled into the dark pit below, and a cloud of dust filled the air. When it settled, I cautiously approached the edge and peered down. What I saw made my stomach drop. The sinkhole wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a doorway to something else entirely. Tangled roots lined the walls, but they weren't random or natural looking. They were arranged in patterns almost like wires or circuits running through the earth. The deeper I looked, the more it seemed like these roots were alive. I radioed Ellen immediately and told her what I'd found. She arrived about an hour later, out of breath and clutching her notebook. "Will," she said as she stared into the sinkhole, "this is incredible." "Incredible?" I asked, still feeling uneasy. "It seems downright creepy." Ellen ignored me and started jotting down notes. "These root structures, they are almost technological." I shook my head. "That doesn't make any sense." She looked up at me with wide eyes. "Maybe it sits not supposed to." Later that day, Ellen dug deeper into her research on Appalachian folklore while I kept an eye on the sinkhole. She called me over to her office that evening with something she'd found. "Will," she said, flipping through an old journal from one of the early settlers. "Listen to this. See, beware the rooted one, for it grows where life fades and feeds on what remains." "See," I frowned. "Feeds on what remains. What does that mean?" Ellen shrugged but looked worried. "I don't know, but this drought might have something to do with it." As days passed, things started getting worse around the park. Plants near the sinkhole began growing at impossible rates. Vines stretched across trails overnight. Flowers bloomed out of season, and mushrooms popped up everywhere like they were taking over. At first, it seemed harmless, just nature doing its thing, but then we started noticing changes in how these plants behaved. Vines moved when you walked by them, almost like they were reaching for you. Certain flowers glowed faintly at night with an eerie bioluminescence that made my skin crawl. And then there were the spores. One afternoon, Raymond came rushing into my cabin looking pale as a ghost. "I breathed something in," he said between gasps for air. "What happened?" I asked as I helped him sit down. "I was tracking deer near that sinkhole," he explained shakily, "and these spores came out of nowhere, like dust floating in the air." "What did they do?" I asked nervously. Raymond looked at me with wide eyes. "I saw things that weren't sipped real." He described vivid hallucinations, trees moving like they had minds of their own and shadows whispering his name. I didn't know what to make of it until later that evening when I went back to check on the sinkhole myself. As I stood near its edge, I noticed tiny particles drifting through the air, spores just like Raymond had described. I held my breath and backed away quickly before they could reach me. That night, as I sat in my cabin trying to make sense of everything, I remembered something, a journal my grandfather had left behind before he disappeared 50 years ago in these very woods. I dug through old boxes until I found it, a worn leather-bound book with pages yellowed from age. As I flipped through it, one entry caught my eye. "We sip seen it, the root walker," he wrote in shaky handwriting. "It sips not just a legend, it sips real." My hands trembled as I read his words. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't sipped new. And whatever this thing was, it had been here all along. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed alive in a way it shouldn't be, like it was breathing, waiting. I decided to head back to the sinkhole to see if anything had changed. Ellen insisted on coming with me, even though I warned her about the spores. As we approached the site, the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us. The plants around the sinkhole had grown even more, vines thicker than my arm twisted through the trees, and strange flowers with glowing centers dotted the ground. It didn't look like nature anymore. It looked wrong. Ellen crouched near the edge of the sinkhole, studying the roots that lined its walls. "Will," she said quietly, "these patterns, they stare not random." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my distance from the spores floating in the air. She pointed to a section of roots that seemed to pulse faintly, like they were alive. "Look at this. It seems almost like communication." I didn't step like where this was going. "Communication with what?" Before she could answer, we heard a sound, a low creaking noise, like wood bending under pressure. It was coming from somewhere deep within the sinkhole. And then we saw it. At first it was just movement, roots shifting and twisting together, but then it began to take shape. A figure rose slowly from the ground, assembling itself piece by piece from the surrounding vegetation. It looked human, but it wasn't. Its body was made of living wood and vines, its face a hollow mask with glowing fungal growths where eyes should be. Ellen froze in place, her notebook slipping from her hands. "Willow, is that?" I didn't let her finish. "Run," I whispered, but neither of us moved. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The ground seemed to pulse with every step it took, and the plants around us shifted as if responding to its presence. Then it spoke, not in words but in a sound that echoed through the forest, vibrating in my chest like a deep hum, and somehow I understood what it was saying. It wasn't just alive, it was aware. Ellen grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the trail. "We need to get out of here." But I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the creature as it turned its hollow face toward me. And then I heard my grandfather's voice. "Will," it said softly, using his tone and cadence perfectly, "you spev come back." My blood ran cold. "No," I whispered under my breath. Ellen looked at me in confusion. "What sep's wrong?" "That sep's my grandfather," I said shakily. "It sep's using his voice." The creature took another step forward, and vines began creeping toward us along the ground. Ellen grabbed me again and shouted, "We have to go now." This time, I listened. We ran as fast as we could back toward my truck, but the forest seemed to close in around us. Vines reached for our legs, flowers released clouds of spores into the air, and shadows moved where they shouldn't have been. By the time we reached safety, both of us were gasping for breath and covered in scratches from the plants trying to grab hold of us. Back at my cabin, Ellen tried to make sense of what we sept seen while I flipped through my grandfather Sep's journal again. It sep's not just a creature, it sep's a part of the forest itself. He was sept written years ago. It feeds on life and absorbs consciousness, but only when conditions are right. I thought about what he meant by conditions. The drought, the dying forest, it was all connected. And now, it had found me. The next few days were a blur. Ellen and I couldn't shake the memory of what we'd seen. The creature, the root walker, wasn't just some legend or hallucination. It was real, and it was growing stronger. The plants around the sinkhole were spreading faster now, creeping into areas of the park they hadn't touched before. It felt like the forest itself was changing, becoming something else. Ellen dove into her research, determined to find answers. She spent hours poring over old documents and government records, trying to piece together the history of this place. Late one night, she called me over to her office. "Will," she said, her voice trembling, "I found something." She handed me a stack of papers, old reports from the 1940s. They detailed secret government testing in the area during World War II. They were experimenting with defoliants, she explained, trying to find ways to clear forests quickly for military operations. I frowned as I flipped through the pages. And what does that have to do with this thing? Ellen pointed to a section of one report that mentioned unexpected biological reactions. "They didn't just kill plants," she said quietly. "They woke something up." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "You think they created this?" She shook her head. "No. I think it was already here. They just made it angry." The more we learned, the more dangerous it seemed. The root walker wasn't just some random creature. It was part of the forest itself, a living network connected to every tree, root, and plant in the area. And now, it was spreading. That evening, Raymond came by again. He looked worse than before, his skin pale and his movements slow, like he was fighting off some kind of sickness. "It's getting closer," he said weakly, as he sat down at my kitchen table. "What do you mean?" I asked. Raymond lifted his shirt to show me his side. Vines were growing out of his skin, thin tendrils wrapping around his ribs like they were trying to pull him apart. I stepped back in horror. "Raymond, what happened?" "I got too close," he said simply. "It sets inside me now." Ellen rushed over and examined him carefully. "The spores," she muttered under her breath. "They spore not just causing hallucinations. They spore-changing people. Raymond grabbed my arm tightly and looked me in the eyes. "You have to stop it," he said firmly, "before it takes everything." I nodded, even though I had no idea how to fight something like this. After Raymond left, Ellen and I started brainstorming ways to stop the root walker from spreading further. We knew it avoided salt and certain copper compounds, probably because they interfered with its ability to grow, but we didn't know if that would be enough. "We need to find its core," Ellen said determinedly as she packed up her gear. I hesitated before answering. "Its core?" She nodded. "Every organism has a central point, a brain or heart that controls everything else. If we can find where it sits rooted, we might be able to stop it." It sounded insane, but at this point I was willing to try anything. We prepared as best we could, packing bags with salt lines, copper solutions, and protective masks to keep out the spores, and headed back into the forest early the next morning. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The trees were twisted beyond recognition, their trunks fused together like they'd grown into one massive organism. The ground pulsed faintly under our feet, and every step felt like walking into something alive. Finally, we found what we were looking for: a network of underground tunnels leading away from the sinkhole. The roots here were thicker than ever, forming walls and ceilings that seemed almost impenetrable. As we moved deeper into the tunnels, Ellen stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. "There," she whispered. In the center of a massive chamber stood the root walker, its body shifting and reforming constantly as vines and roots fed into it from every direction. Around it were human remains, preserved bodies tangled in roots like they'd been absorbed into the creature itself. And then I saw him. My grandfather's face appeared briefly on one of the vines before dissolving back into the creature's form. "Will," it said softly in his voice again, "you can stop me." I clenched my fists tightly as fear and anger battled inside me. We didn't have much time. I stood frozen, staring at the creature in the center of the chamber. Its shifting, twisting body seemed to breathe with the forest itself. The faces of people it had absorbed, my grandfather's included, appeared briefly in the vines before fading back into the mass. It wasn't just alive, it was aware, and it knew we were there. Ellen tugged at my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Will we have to act now?" she whispered urgently. "If we don't stop it here, it's going to spread beyond the park." I nodded, gripping the bag of copper solution tightly in my hands. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. The creature turned toward us, its hollow face glowing faintly with fungal light. The vines around its body began to move, creeping toward us like fingers reaching for prey. "Stay close," I said to Ellen, as we moved cautiously into the chamber. The air was thick with spores, and even through our masks I could feel them pressing against my skin. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was trying to pull us down. Suddenly, a vine shot out from the creature's body, wrapping around Ellen's leg and dragging her toward the center of the chamber. She screamed and tried to fight it off, but it was too strong. "Ellen," I shouted, rushing forward. I grabbed a handful of salt from my bag and threw it onto the vine. It recoiled instantly, releasing her and retreating back toward the creature. Ellen scrambled to her feet, breathing heavily but unharmed. "It doesn't set like salt," she gasped. I nodded quickly. "Let's use that to our advantage." We worked together to create a perimeter around the chamber, using salt lines and copper solution, hoping to weaken the creature's connection to the roots feeding into it. But it wasn't going down without a fight. More vines shot out from its body, whipping through the air and trying to grab hold of us. One wrapped around my arm, pulling me toward the creature's glowing core. I could feel its strength, like it was trying to absorb me into itself. Desperate, I reached for my knife and slashed at the vine until it let go. My arm burned where it had touched me, but I didn't stop moving. Finally, we reached the center of the chamber, the creature's core. It pulsed faintly with light, surrounded by tangled roots that seemed almost impossible to penetrate. "This is it," Ellen said firmly. "We have to destroy this." I pulled out the container of concentrated fungicide we'd brought with us, the last resort we'd hoped we wouldn't need, and poured it directly onto the core. The effect was immediate. The creature let out a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the chamber as its body began to dissolve. The vines around us writhed violently before collapsing into lifeless heaps on the ground. The pulsing light faded slowly until there was nothing left but silence. It was over. But not without cost. Ellen had been hit by one of the vines during our final push and collapsed shortly after we escaped the chamber. She didn't make it through the night. The spores had taken hold too deeply. Raymond wasn't much better off. The vines growing from his body couldn't be removed without killing him, and he chose to stay in isolation in his cabin near the park's edge. As for me, I couldn't leave this place behind. The Park Service quarantined the area, citing dangerous fungal contamination as their official explanation, but I knew better. The root walker wasn't gone. It was just dormant again, waiting for another drought or another chance to grow. I took a permanent position monitoring this section of the park, installing rain gauges and keeping an eye on every stream bed and root system nearby. And every night as I walk these trails alone, I hear my grandfather's voice in the wind. "Will," he whispers softly from somewhere deep in the forest. My name is Daniel Everson, but most people just call me Dan. I'm a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. It's not just a job for me, it's my way of keeping the past buried. You see, before this, I was a Navy SEAL. I spent years diving into the darkest depths of the ocean, doing things I can't talk about, but one mission went wrong, really wrong. Since then, tight spaces and dark waters have haunted me. The caves, though, they're different. I can control them, map them, understand them. They make sense. It was spring of 1991, and the rain wouldn't stop. Days of heavy downpours had flooded parts of the cave system that hadn't seen water in decades. It was a mess. Tourists were stranded, and we were running rescue operations non-stop. That's where it all started. I was leading a team to find a group of spelunkers who had gotten trapped in one of the lower chambers. The water was rising fast, and time wasn't on our side. As we moved deeper into the cave, something strange happened. The echoes, those normal sounds you hear bouncing off the walls, they weren't right. They were sharper, almost like whispers cutting through the air. "Dan," Franklin Walsh said, shining his flashlight ahead. Franklin was an old-timer who'd been guiding tours here for decades. "You hear that?" I nodded, but didn't answer. I didn't want to spook anyone. Rusty, my therapy dog, a loyal Labrador trained for cave rescues, was with us too. He stopped suddenly, ears perked up, staring into the darkness like he'd seen something. Rusty never acted like that, unless there was trouble. We found the spelunkers huddled on a ledge above the rising water, scared but alive. As we helped them back to safety, those strange echoes followed us the whole way out. They sounded almost like voices, soft and distant, but no one else seemed to notice. That night, as I sat in my cabin drying off Rusty and going over maps of newly discovered passages, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't set right in those caves. Franklin stopped by with coffee and told me about an old legend his family used to tell, the story of the Pale Swimmers. "They said are old tales," he said with a shrug. "Creatures that live deep in the caves where no light ever touches. My granddad swore he saw one once when he was a boy." I laughed it off at first, but deep down I couldn't ignore what I'd felt earlier. The whispers, Rusty's reaction, something was down there. The rain didn't let up. By the next morning, the flooding had gotten worse, swallowing parts of the cave system we hadn't explored yet. I was called in to check out a newly revealed chamber. The water had carved through the rock, opening up a passage no one had ever seen before. Franklin came along, and so did Dr. Tanya Morris, a geologist studying the caves for unusual formations. Rusty trotted by my side, his tail wagging like he didn't have a care in the world. The new chamber was eerie. The walls were covered in strange carvings, petroglyphs of humanoid figures with long limbs and no faces. Tanya ran her hand over them, her eyes wide with curiosity. "These are ancient," she whispered, "but they don't match anything I've seen before." Franklin stood back, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "Pale swimmers," he muttered under his breath. I didn't say anything, but my gut told me he wasn't far off. As we moved deeper into the chamber, the air grew colder, and the echoes returned. Those sharp whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rusty stopped again, growling softly this time. Tanya knelt to collect a water sample near the edge of a flooded tunnel. "Dan," she said, holding up the vial, "this isn't set normal water. There's something organic in it." Before I could ask what she meant, Franklin shouted from ahead, "Over here." We rushed to him and found something that made my stomach drop. Equipment scattered across the floor. A flashlight, a helmet, and a notebook. All belonging to 3 researchers who had gone missing earlier that week. But there was no sign of them anywhere. Rusty barked suddenly, his fur standing on end as he stared into the flooded tunnel ahead. I shone my flashlight into the water but saw nothing except ripples breaking the surface. Then came the sound, a low hum that vibrated through the rock, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. "Let's go," I said quickly, pulling Tanya and Franklin back toward the exit. As we climbed out of the chamber, Tanya stumbled and grabbed her arm. "It burns," she said, wincing in pain. "What burns?" I asked. "The water," she replied weakly. It touched me. I didn't know what was happening to her, but I knew we couldn't stay down there any longer. Back at base camp, Tanya's condition worsened. Her skin near where the water had touched her turned pale and blotchy, almost translucent. She complained of hearing voices, soft whispers calling her back to the caves. Meanwhile, sonar equipment set up near the flooded tunnels picked up movement, large objects swimming deep below us. Franklin's face turned pale when he saw the readings. "They sip her awake," he said quietly. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "The pale swimmers," he replied. "They only come out when the caves flood." Tanya's condition wasn't getting any better. Her arm looked worse, almost like the skin was thinning, turning translucent. She kept mumbling about the voices she heard, saying they were calling her back. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those caves wasn't done with us yet. The sonar readings showed more movement. Large, slow shapes gliding through the flooded tunnels. Franklin didn't want to go back down there, and honestly, I didn't blame him, but I needed answers. If those researchers were still alive, we had to find them. And if Tanya's infection was connected to the water, we needed to figure out what was causing it. I geared up for another dive into the chamber. This time I brought extra lights and sonar equipment to track anything moving in the water. Rusty stayed close, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Franklin insisted on coming with me, even though I could see the fear in his eyes. The flooded tunnel was darker than anything I'd ever seen before. My flashlight barely cut through the murky water as we swam deeper, following the sonar signals. The echoes returned, those sharp whispers, but now they sounded like voices. They weren't words exactly, but they felt human. Rusty barked suddenly, his paws splashing in the shallow water as he stared ahead. I turned my flashlight toward where he was looking and froze. Something moved in the water. At first I thought it was a fish or maybe debris drifting with the current. But then it surfaced, a pale shape with long, thin limbs and skin so translucent I could see its veins beneath. It had no eyes, just smooth skin where a face should have been. It tilted its head toward us like it could sense we were there. "Dan," Franklin whispered, his voice trembling, "we need to go." The creature slipped back into the water without making a sound, disappearing into the darkness. My heart pounded as I tried to process what I'd just seen. We pushed forward cautiously until we reached another chamber, a massive space carved out by centuries of flooding. The walls were covered in more petroglyphs, but these were different. They showed scenes of creatures, like the one we'd just seen hunting humans. In the center of the chamber was something even stranger, piles of human remains arranged in what looked like a ritual pattern. Bones stacked neatly, skulls placed in a circle. It wasn't random. Franklin grabbed my arm tightly. "This isn't set natural," he said. "They stir not just animals." Before I could respond, my helmet camera picked up movement again, several pale shapes swimming just below the surface of the water surrounding us. They moved fast, too fast for anything human. Then came the sound, the low hum from before, but this time it was louder and sharper. It felt like it was inside my head, pulling at my thoughts and making it hard to focus. Rusty barked furiously as one of the creatures emerged from the water, its bioluminescent markings glowing faintly in the dark. The glow seemed to pulse, almost hypnotic, and for a moment I felt myself drawn to it, like it was pulling me closer. "Dan!" Franklin shouted, snapping me out of it. I grabbed Rusty and backed away slowly as more creatures surfaced around us. Their movements were smooth and deliberate, like they were studying us or hunting us. I don't know how we made it out of that chamber. The creatures didn't chase us, but I could feel their presence watching, waiting. Franklin was pale as a ghost, and Rusty wouldn't stop growling. Back at base camp, I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Tanya was worse now. Her skin had turned almost completely translucent, and she kept muttering about the deep ones and the call. She wasn't making any sense. I started digging through old records, trying to find anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I came across something I wasn't supposed to see: classified military documents from the 1950s. They talked about sound experiments conducted in the caves, tests on low-frequency vibrations, and their effects on living organisms. The reports mentioned strange sightings during the experiments, but the project was shut down abruptly. No reason was given. It all started to click. The creatures, the pale swimmers, they weren't just animals. They were something more, something ancient, and they used sound to hunt, to communicate, maybe even to control their prey. I knew we couldn't just leave things as they were. Those caves were flooded now, and the creatures were active. If we didn't do something, more people would go missing, or worse. I modified some of our diving equipment with high-intensity lights and acoustic deterrents, devices designed to emit frequencies that might disrupt the creature's echolocation. Franklin thought I was crazy for going back down there, but he agreed to help me set up explosives to seal off the deepest passages. The dive back into the caves was tense. Every sound echoed differently now, sharper and more deliberate, like the caves themselves were alive. Rusty stayed close, his ears twitching at every noise. We reached the ceremonial chamber again, and this time it was worse than before. More remains had been added to the piles, fresh ones. I recognized one of the helmets as belonging to one of the missing researchers. The creatures were there too. Swimming just below the surface of the water, their bioluminescent markings glowed faintly in the dark, pulsing in patterns that felt almost hypnotic. I set up the explosives quickly, while Franklin kept watch. Rusty growled softly, his eyes locked on the water. Then it happened. One of the creatures emerged from the water right in front of us. It stood tall on its elongated limbs, its translucent skin shimmering in the light. It tilted its head toward me like it could sense my fear. The hum returned, louder and sharper than ever before, and I felt my thoughts slipping away. Memories flashed through my mind. My time as a Navy SEAL, the mission that went wrong, everything I'd tried to forget. "Dan," Franklin shouted, shaking me out of it. I activated one of the acoustic deterrents, and the creature recoiled instantly, slipping back into the water with an unnatural screech. The others followed, retreating into the depths as the sound filled the chamber. We didn't wait around after that. I triggered the explosives remotely as we swam back toward safety. The blast shook the caves violently, collapsing parts of the passageways and sealing off the deepest chambers where the creatures lived. The explosion worked. The deepest passages were sealed, and the creatures, at least the ones we saw, were trapped behind tons of rock. The hum stopped, and the caves fell silent again. But the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt hollow, like something was still watching us. Franklin and I made it back to the surface, exhausted and shaken. Rusty stayed close, his tail wagging weakly as if he knew we'd survived something terrible. But the relief didn't last long. Tanya was gone. She'd disappeared while we were in the caves. Her cabin was empty, her belongings untouched, and there was no sign of where she might have gone. All that was left was a trail of wet footprints leading toward the cave entrance. I searched for her for hours, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. But deep down, I knew she wasn't coming back. Whatever had happened to her, whatever that water had done, she belonged to them now. The National Park Service issued a statement the next day saying the new passages were unstable and dangerous. They restricted access to most of the flooded areas, citing safety concerns. But I knew the truth. Those caves weren't just dangerous, they were alive with something ancient and deadly. I tried to move on after that, but it wasn't easy. 4 members of our team were dead. Tanya was gone, and Franklin refused to talk about what we'd seen. Rusty stayed by my side like always, but even he seemed different. Quieter, more watchful. Weeks later, I started hearing reports from other parks in the region. Stories about strange sightings near flooded cave systems. People talked about pale figures swimming in underground lakes or whispers echoing through empty tunnels. I knew it wasn't set over. One night, I packed my gear, lights, acoustic deterrents, everything I could think of, and loaded it into my truck. Rusty hopped into the passenger seat without hesitation, his eyes fixed on me like he understood what we were doing. I wasn't just a park ranger anymore. I was a hunter, a protector, and I wouldn't let those creatures take anyone else. As I drove toward the next cave system where sightings had been reported, I couldn't help but wonder how many of them were out there, and how deep their world really went. The explosion worked. The deepest passages were sealed, and the creatures, at least the ones we saw, were trapped behind tons of rock. The hum stopped, and the caves fell silent again. But the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt hollow, like something was still watching us. Franklin and I made it back to the surface, exhausted and shaken. Rusty stayed close, his tail wagging weakly as if he knew we'd survived something terrible, but the relief didn't last long. Tanya was gone. She disappeared while we were in the caves. Her cabin was empty, her belongings untouched, and there was no sign of where she might have gone. All that was left was a trail of wet footprints leading toward the cave entrance. I searched for her for hours, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. But deep down, I knew she wasn't coming back. Whatever had happened to her, whatever that water had done, she belonged to them now. The National Park Service issued a statement the next day saying the new passages were unstable and dangerous. They restricted access to most of the flooded areas, citing safety concerns. But I knew the truth. Those caves weren't just dangerous, they were alive with something ancient and deadly. I tried to move on after that, but it wasn't easy. 4 members of our team were dead. Tanya was gone, and Franklin refused to talk about what we'd seen. Rusty stayed by my side like always, but even he seemed different, quieter, more watchful. Weeks later, I started hearing reports from other parks in the region, stories about strange sightings near flooded cave systems. People talked about pale figures swimming in underground lakes or whispers echoing through empty tunnels. I knew it wasn't set over. One night, I packed my gear, lights, acoustic deterrents, everything I could think of, and loaded it into my truck. Rusty hopped into the passenger seat without hesitation, his eyes fixed on me like he understood what we were doing. I wasn't just a park ranger anymore. I was a hunter, a protector, and I wouldn't let those creatures take anyone else. As I drove toward the next cave system where sightings had been reported, I couldn't help but wonder how many of them were out there, and how deep their world really went.